All right, folks, we have ourselves officially an off season. Hey, I'm going to check one thing here. But when you try to record these things, you can hear me fine, right? I just heard a big old buzz. I heard a big old buzz. Well, let's just say it again. We have ourselves officially an off season. We officially are starting the end when we say goodbye to baseball and goodbye to that friend that's always there for you. We're facing the winter. But let's get warm. Let's get cozy with Miller Thomas of Locked On Diamondbacks. This is a Locked On Diamondbacks, Locked On MLB crossover. Hello, baseball fans. Welcome to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. This is the daily podcast. We talk about all of Major League Baseball. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. If you don't believe me, you can look right down there. That's my lower third. You can call me Sully. You're not allowed to do a lower third and not have it be 100% accurate. Otherwise, Locked On will shut you down. I am an Emmy-nominated television producer. I've been a comedian, a writer, a filmmaker, all a bunch of stuff. But mainly, I've been a baseball podcaster for the last 10 seasons. And I've completed my fourth complete season at the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. Right over there is Mr. Baja Kaloop himself. That's Miller Thomas. Tell people who you are, why you are, and when you are.
Yeah, Miller Thomas. You can follow me on Twitter at CreatorThomas24 for my personal account. You can follow us on YouTube, Locked On Diamondbacks there, where all your podcasting platforms are. I started, I think, right before the 2020 pandemic season. So I think this is like my third season that I just finished up here, Sully.
That's wild because it seems like the pandemic just started. But then it also seems like it's 40 years ago. Time and space doesn't matter anymore. You say it's 3 years. We've had, since the pandemic, we've had the Dodgers, the Braves, and the Astros win the World Series. That's unbelievable. And I don't feel like I've been a Locked On Podcast Network that long, but I've now been there for 4 different World Series. And my voice broke.
Yeah, you're getting a little high pitched there, Sully. And if you've lived in Arizona throughout the whole pandemic, it's basically like you haven't lived in the pandemic because we don't follow any rules out here in AZ. So it's been an interesting time. And so it's been the way time has been the last, couple of years. I feel like it's just been one long linear loop. Time is a flat circle. And I feel like we haven't aged at all since the 2020 season.
Oh, by the way, friend of the podcast, Melissa Monto, and her fantastic husband, David Monto, who Melissa's been on the show. She's a rabid baseball fan from Texas. Naturally, she's a Red Sox fan. And she and her husband reported live from Game 2 of the ALCS last year when the Red Sox seemed to be able to hit grand slams at will in the first 3 games of the ALCS. She's in Arizona right now. She and her husband, her amazing husband, David, are traveling the country from their town in Texas. They cut through New Mexico, and they're now in Arizona. Posted a bunch of pictures. I know Melissa listens to this podcast. She's been on the podcast. So have fun in the AZ and honk your horn when you drive past Miller Thomas. Hey, Miller, by the way, follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter and Instagram. I'm your pal Sully at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. When you were last on the show, the World Series, I think, was knotted 1-1. And we've had a slugfest. We've had a no-hitter. We've had a thriller. And we've had a clincher since then. I did a recap of the clinching game 6 in yesterday's show. And I've talked about each game individually. Tell me your thoughts on this series. What your thoughts of where it ranked and some of the emotions you had on this roller coaster. At some point, it looked like the Phillies could get a hit whenever they won. And then one day they literally got 0.
Yeah, this series basically had all you could want from your classic playoff World Series because you had the first the battle of the underdog versus the team that's hated by everyone, right? You have the new evil empire, the Houston Astros, move over New York Yankees. You guys got one World Series title in the last 20 years. It's the Houston Astros who are the new evil empire, and they were going against this Philadelphia Phillies team that was scrappy but knew how to put runs on the board, had two great frontline starters, and had a player in Bryce Harper who is, the LeBron James of baseball, the chosen one of baseball. So you have these two really interesting competing narratives. And when we saw it play out on the field, I mean, it was as good as it's got, because you had that 1-1 the last time we talked. And since then, like you lamented, we had the Phillies in that game 3. They just completely broke out and their offense was amazing. You're like, this Phillies offense throughout their entire postseason has probably been the best playoff offense. Meanwhile, look at the Astros offense, and it probably hasn't been that great during the playoffs. It's really been their pitching and their bullpen specifically, who just had the lowest bullpen ERA, I think, of all time in the playoff series. So you're like, all right, if this Phillies offense can continue to do that, I'm not sure if this Astros offense can compete with it. And then what do we see the Astros do after that? They completely bounce back with their pitching. That they have that combined no-hitter. I know you probably want to make the case for Framber Valdez being the MVP of this series, because
Absolutely.
the pitching for this Astros squad this whole series was phenomenal, specifically the bullpen. And in the end, I kind of made the prediction on my pod a couple of days ago where I was like, whoever wins game 5, I think is going to win game 6 and win the series, because you're going to have Verlander versus a Noah Syndergaard, a bullpen game by the Phillies. And it was like, if the Phillies are able to win that kind of a bullpen game, then you go with Zach Wheeler in game 6. I felt like Zach Wheeler would have just stepped up in that moment. And he was stepping up in game 6 before Rob Thompson pulled him. And, we could get into the particulars of that. I know you had a whole podcast last night, which you probably lamented on that decision, but this Astros versus Phillies team, you had your big managerial decisions in here that you could nitpick through every game. You had clutch offenses. You had a rookie win the World Series MVP. I mean, this series had pretty much everything you could want in a playoff series, and I think it was one of the most exciting ones we've seen over the last few years.
Yeah, I thought it was a good World Series. I thought it was a good one. I'm gonna, anytime a World Series doesn't go 7, I fall short of calling it great.
Okay.
We had a couple of we had 3 truly classic games in this. The first game, the wild come from behind victory by Philadelphia. That was tremendous. That was an incredible game. Obviously, you have a combined no-hitter. That's got to be a memorable one. And yeah, I know people think it's sexier to have one pitcher go the distance, but I think it was apt for this team that it was a combined one, because it was the depth of their pitching staff that led this, that made this happen. And, for Dusty Baker, who the knock on him, obviously, over the years was his inability to handle a pitching staff. Well, now I said, what do you like? How do you like me now? I handled them during a combined no-hitter. And he got a lot of flack in game 3 for letting McCullers stay in for probably an inning too long, and then bringing Urquidy in to basically finish the game out. But in the end, for the long run, that actually turned out to be that helped out the Astros, that they were able to stretch McCullers a little bit. They weren't going to use Urquidy any other way, so they might as well use him as a 3-inning mop-up man. That was his only appearance, I think, in the entire postseason, if I'm not mistaken. And not a bad only appearance, 3 shutout innings against the Philadelphia team that seemed to be able to score at will. But that meant in game 4, everyone was rested. Everyone was ready to go. And when, Valdez took the no-hitter through 6, he was able to go bring in his 3 best relievers and mow them down. And then when you take a look, remember how, Philadelphia was losing 5-0 in game 1. They came storming back. Then they hit 5 home runs in game 3. They scored 3 runs the rest of the World Series. And 2 of them were solo homers by Kyle Schwarber.
Mm-hmm.
They got 1 run that wasn't a solo home run from Schwarber from the moment they hit those 5 home runs off of McCullers in game 3 until they flew out to Tucker to end the finale. They drove in 1 run that wasn't a launch from Schwarber. And that is, for all the knocks over the years, leaving Pryor in too long, not making the right pitching choice when he was with the Giants in the '02 World Series, not making the right choice with the Reds and the Nationals and blah, 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 blah. He punched every button perfectly from that point on and shut down an offense that was incredible. And, I mean, I know most people were rooting for Philadelphia. I was rooting for Houston. Despite the fact, if you read my tweets and my response to the tweets, Twitter hater, Twitter, Houston Astros Twitter still are calling me a massive hater and with an unreasonable hatred of the Astros, even though I rooted for their team to win the World Series the last 2 years. So obviously my hatred for the team is unbridled at this point. I cried when I saw Dusty Baker win. I thought of my dad rooting for the Giants. But this was more than just there have been managers who managed a world championship in spite of themselves. Bob Brenly could not have managed the 2001 Diamondbacks worse than he did, and they still wound up winning. John Farrell of the Red Sox made some bizarre decisions when they won the 2013 World Series. I'm convinced the gamblers paid off both Davey Johnson and John McNamara to throw the 1986 World Series, because that's the only explanation for how horribly they managed that team. So you can win despite the manager. I think that they won because of the manager. He hit every button, pressed every button correctly, and had the impossible task of taking over a hated franchise and focused them. And look where they are. I mean, it was a wonderful, wonderful moment, and he was behind the 8 ball. When he was down 2-0 or 2-1, we all had this image at 2-1 in Philadelphia. We all had images in our head of, oh my God, they're going to drop the next 2 games, aren't they? Philadelphia's about to win the World Series, aren't they? And then that would hang over Dusty Baker. But I think it was a very good World Series. Certainly had a lot of thrills. And the finale had the great come from behind home run. The one thing I knock on the finale is you just got the sense after that home run, it was over. And certainly after Schwarber tried to bunt. What was that?
Yeah, I don't understand having the best home run hitter in the National League trying to bunt and potentially his final plate appearance with already 2 strikes on the board. I don't get that. If you're Dusty Baker, you're now the oldest manager ever to win a World Series, and I think that's the driving narrative that people who are like big haters of the Astros are holding on to. They're like, at least Dusty Baker got his chip, and we can at least root for that, because no one in our MLB group chat seems to be happy that the Astros won the World Series. So I think a lot of people are clinging on to Dusty Baker right now, being the oldest manager and being the good guy he is to win this World Series.
Right,
but the Phillies offense, when you look at the pitching staff by the Astros, they were 0 for their last 31 against breaking pitches against this Astros pitching staff. This Phillies offense could not do anything against the breaking pitch, and that was a huge issue for this Phillies offense. As the series wore on, they chased that pitch more and more in counts. And for Rob Thompson, I mean, it really was a battle of Dusty Baker versus Rob Thompson, and Dusty Baker seems to have gotten the advantage one because he won the World Series. And for Rob Thompson, I think the 2 biggest decisions you're going to go back to is in Game 4 and Game 6 when you pull Aaron Nola. When he has those bases loaded, you bring in Jose Alvarado. He gives up those multiple runs right there. So you question whether you should have pulled Aaron Nola. He has been struggling over his last 3 games. Do you pull him in that situation? It was a big question, and obviously it didn't work out. And then in Game 6, you pull Zach Wheeler when he was dominating and kind of do the same thing. You bring in Jose Alvarado once again, and once again, Alvarado wasn't able to close the door. So I think those are going to be the 2 big pivot points you look back to during this series for Rob Thompson versus Dusty Baker.
I didn't have a problem with him pulling in Game 4. It seemed like the right move. Sometimes you can make the right move and it just doesn't work. Smoltz made the great point that they had seen Alvarado so many times that maybe if you were going to pull Wheeler at that point, you bring someone else in other than the person they've seen a billion times, or just keep rolling the dice with Wheeler. I understand it's an elimination game. You gotta pull the trigger a little quicker than you normally would. Wheeler pitched really well, but they were starting to get to him, and I my main criticism was maybe you should use somebody else, because I'm telling you something. When you see someone that many times, it's just a surefire bet that you're going to see a fat pitch that you're going to hit. And I don't think the ball that Alvarez hit has landed yet. By the way, if you're going to make any bets, go to Bet Online. Bet Online is your number one source for betting football and the start of the new basketball season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis on every game. And as always, Bet Online remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-minute scores for every sport out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on your favorite games and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Do they have hockey? They must have hockey there. See your Coyotes there. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. Bet Online, it's where the game starts. And hey, thanks so much for making Locked On MLB your first listen today. Make your second listen, well, have that be Locked On Diamondbacks. Your third listen, keep on listening. Locked On Sports Today, from the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports. Go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights that only Locked On can provide. Locked On Today. Locked On Sports Today. Get that title right, Sully. Available on this app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.